Do your youngsters ever ask you, what did you do before television was invented? Now, sometimes it's hard to answer that question in a way that they'll understand. We read, and we played out in the fresh air a lot more, or at least that's what we tell the kids. But maybe there's another answer.
KWVA Eugene.
You suckers. Hello, dirtbags! This is Master Shake from the Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and you're listening to KWVA Eugene.
Hello, I'm Ralph Nader, and you're listening to KWVA 88.1 FM. Listen hard.
The news and opinions expressed on Occupy Radio may not necessarily reflect the views of KWVA Eugene, the University of Oregon, or the Associated Students of the University of Oregon.
From KWVA in Eugene and the Occupy Eugene Media Group, this is Occupy Radio, an extended discussion of the issues which gave rise to the Occupy movement. I'm your host, David Geitgey Sierralupe.
The U.S. empire is a lot weaker than it used to be. If this was 20, 30 years ago, the U.S. would have imposed a military solution by now, whether it's through invasion or so-called no-fly zone or whatever. But it can't fight simultaneous wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and various other countries around the world with a new flare-up in Korea and so on. It just doesn't have the money and the manpower and the political will to impose itself on these countries like it used to. That's actually an encouraging sign.
Howdy, howdy, occupiers, and welcome to Occupy Radio. On tonight's Occupy Radio, we get some perspective on the world outside the borders of the United States. Journalist and author Reese Ehrlich gives us a vantage point within the Middle East. And Craig Graham of GlobalConflictAnalysis.com highlights China and Korea and reminds us that Canadians are Americans too. It's been 10 years since the coalition of the willing shocked and awed Iraq's government into the ground. As a matter of fact, the name Coalition of the Willing seems to indicate a shortage of willing partners for the illegal invasion of a foreign country. Since then, the coalitions have been harder to maintain and increasingly unwilling. So much so, America is beginning to appear more and more as the lone gunman. Public opinion was decidedly against the Iraq War by 2006. If we had the capacity for a nationwide public referendum, the Iraq War would have been a clear loser with the voters 4 years before the last of our combat troops left the country. Increasingly, that's the way it is with America. America doesn't seem to concern itself with public opinion. Massive disapproval doesn't seem to slow it down. Clearly, it doesn't matter if that disapproval comes from outside the United States or within. The foreign policy and the war policy of America doesn't reflect the will of the people of the United States. The same can be said for American economic policy or America's environmental and human rights policies. None of the major actions of America represent the will of the people of the United States. America has become unmoored from the country that birthed it. When you really sit down and think about it, America and the United States have become two distinct entities. America is a global power with exclusively global interests. Benefit to the people of the United States is no longer the primary motivation for the American state. The American state wages war without the approval of the people of the United States. American drones invade other countries without the approval of the people of the United States. America didn't even need the approval of the United States voters to go to war in Libya. But American foreign policy is just the start. I'm going to explore the concept of a separate American state over the next few months. Has America become a foreign entity? Should those of us in the U.S. begin to look at America as a foreign state and treat it as such? Craig Graham is a former political and security analyst for the Canadian government. On globalconflictanalysis.com, Craig gets behind the scenes on major conflicts across the globe and explains what is going on and why. He joins us to talk about Korea, China, and the Middle East. Thank you for joining us on Occupy Radio, Craig.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me.
After surveying your website a bit, my impression is that you're not picky about which conflicts you go after. And I guess I should give a little bit more of let me back up just a little bit. And I would like you to just explain to my listeners Global Conflict Analysis, your website, and what your mission is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at Global Conflict Analysis, essentially what I do is I like to take stories from the news headlines. I will look at them, and I like to give some kind of historical background about them so that my readers can have a little bit more perspective and understanding about what's going on. But then I also like to give my own personal analysis about where I think the conflict is going and the potential implications for international actors and other countries could be.
Okay, good. Yeah, so that was the sense I got is that you're roping in all of this information, and I haven't seen a website that is doing it in such the fashion that you're doing it in, roping in all this information and then putting it into perspective, which is I think that's the most important element.
I think so, and I think one of the major challenges with news media is just a lot of the language that is used, the terminology, it's all very matter of fact, and this is the way it is, and it doesn't really give you much perspective or analysis into what is actually going on in these various conflicts. And so I do like to give my analysis and my opinion and try to explain things in a broader context, just so that you don't just read the news headlines and say, oh, this is happening here or there. You get a little bit more understanding about what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common for those of us here in the United States, especially, and in the Western world in general, I think, to read about a hotspot somewhere in the world and think, oh yeah, well, those people are violent. That happens there all the time. And that's the extent of it. We don't give it any more thought.
I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is I am just trying to help readers just understand quite a bit more about what's going on, so that you don't just assume that these people in, let's say, Pakistan or Afghanistan are just inherently violent. There are so many more factors, political, economic, cultural, historical factors that are going on that you don't get out of a common news report.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's why I turned to you, and that's why I'm so happy to have you on the program. Now, one of your recent posts was talking about renewed sanctions against North Korea. And North Korea is a really interesting player on the world stage right now. And I just wonder how they're going to look in retrospect when history looks back on this period of time. Yeah, where are they taking us? Where are we heading with North Korea?
Sure. I find that one of the biggest problems when looking in the social sciences in general, but more specifically in international relations, is that the major challenge is we're trying to predict human behavior, essentially. So the people we are dealing with, North Korea, it's run by human leaders. We're trying to understand what's going on there and then try to predict what these people are going to do. So, I mean, it's always very difficult to make any kind of predictions. That's why everything is always looked at in probabilities as a percentage of a probability. There really is no way to tell for certain how anything is going to go. But to give my analysis on what's going on in North Korea, essentially what has happened is since the death of Kim Jong-il, and his son has taken over, there's been a shift in how things are done in North Korea. There's been a bit of a challenge to sort of the traditional status quo of things. First of all, the new leader of North Korea is basically trying to establish himself in the world as well as establish himself in North Korea. Kim Jong-un is essentially trying to not only establish himself as a powerful player, but also trying to test the world, especially the United States, over what it could or could not do on the world stage. So basically what it's trying to do right now, or what the leaders of North Korea is trying to do right now, is they're really trying to draw attention to themselves, in my opinion. The odds of North Korea. I mean, they threatened to end the 1953 armistice, which they signed with South Korea, which essentially put an end to the open conflict in the Korean War. That kind of threat, while it is notable to take that into account, it doesn't really tell the entire story, in that North Korea, first of all, is a very, very impoverished country. They have a number of sanctions that hurt their economy very badly, and they're in desperate need of aid. And one of the ways that North Korea has traditionally gone about trying to seek aid and seek attention to its problems is by making a big scene on the world stage and drawing people in. While the possibility for conflict is always present, one of the major restraining factors that North Korea has is that China would very likely not let them do anything too rash. And if the North Korean leaders went against China and, attempted to attack South Korea or American forces in the region, then it's very unlikely that China would back them in that. And it's much more likely that we would see probably a devastating conflict, but a relatively short conflict, and probably the overthrow of the North Korean regime.
I guess we're struck with the opposing views. The international community has been poo-pooing the threats against Washington, D.C., the nuclear threats by North Korea, saying almost like, isn't that a cute little notion there, and patting them on the head. Yeah, you let us know when those nukes are ready and we'll be concerned. Within Korea, do they see themselves, do you think, as Dr. Evil, perhaps? They're gonna marshal the forces and carry the banner, and all those other people who are eager to overthrow empire are gonna fall in line behind them.
Right. There's a certain way that the North Korean regime operates that obviously it tries to project a certain image of itself to its own citizens, and then in turn to the rest of the world, but more importantly to its own citizens, in order to retain the amount of power that it has over its citizens. From the research that I've done, it appears that the North Korean regime really uses a lot of its efforts to convince its own people and to basically enforce in the mindset of its own people that the regime is everlasting, and countries like the United States are imperialist forces, and they are constantly threatening North Korea and threatening to invade North Korea, and therefore any kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula would be essentially to defend the homeland of North Korea. They really try and indoctrinate the people that it's a very much a Cold War mentality, an East versus West kind of idea, where we might look at them and say that the North Korean regime is this kind of Dr. Evil, like you say, kind of regime. They're actually very calculating in how they operate, and they're thinking everything through very, very well, as you can imagine. They're not irrational.
That's one of the things that our information system here in the United States likes to put out there, is all these irrational players on the global scene. And it seems to me that's just short-sighted. There's a lot of smart people out there.
Absolutely. And you can't think for a second that the people who are running the country of North Korea, despite how the country may look from our perspective, you cannot paint that picture of them being less intelligent than us or somehow acting in a way that is against their own interests or against our interests. Everything they're doing is very calculated, and they're doing it in their own interests for the most part, absolutely.
Okay. And you basically have appraised the situation as heated locally, not likely to expand beyond that. And that's where I'd like to take this conversation next is, you're not looking at just one part of the world, you're looking at the whole world. So in your estimation, which are the hot spots right now that have the potential to expand beyond just the local impact that they might have now and turn into something bigger that we're going to want to know about?
As I said before, it's obviously very difficult to determine whether or not a conflict will get worse or spread or not. And of course, as I said, the very reason for this is trying to predict human behavior. It's essentially difficult trying to predict the unpredictable. However, based on the best evidence that we have available, I would say that the ongoing and parallel conflicts in the Middle East definitely a region to pay close attention to, especially, obviously, the conflict in Syria is obviously of greatest concern for international implications. I mean, that being said, it's very important to watch developments in the Asia-Pacific region, the recent conflict on the island of Borneo involving the Philippines and Malaysia. It's especially concerning because of China's potential to use the conflict as an opportunity. While at the same time, that conflict may remain localized for many years even. It's always important to remember that China, as a rising power, is always kind of waiting in the wings, if you want to look at it like that. They will take opportunity out of where they see fit.
They are waiting for their serve in the international ping pong game.
Yeah, basically.
Uh-huh.
There are a number of other conflicts that are definitely areas to pay close attention to. Pakistan is always an area of extreme concern for the international community. There are a number of ongoing ethnic conflicts, interreligious conflicts. Increasingly, Pakistan is becoming more unstable for various number of reasons. And of course, the intervention in Mali very well could have implications for the Central African region in general. And now there's renewed conflict in the Central African Republic. And then, we could go on and we could talk about Burma or even Kashmir.
Mali has actually gotten some headlines lately, and so maybe could you explain what the issues are there?
A lot of the problems surrounding Mali right now kind of go back to the intervention in Libya and the Libyan civil war. A lot of weapons and essentially mercenaries flowed out of Libya following the Libyan civil war in 2011, and a number of these mercenaries are known as, they're called ethnic Tuaregs, and they are originally from the region called the Azawad region in northern Mali. And these mercenaries who worked for Gaddafi's government, essentially a roving band of mercenaries with tons of weaponry, found themselves in the Azawad region and were able to challenge the government. The government didn't have the security ability to enforce sovereignty over Azawad. And so the Tuaregs and a number of other rebel groups were able to overthrow the government. In the region, anyway. The Mali government still holds control of the rest of the country, but northern Mali has become increasingly factious, and AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is an offshoot of the Al-Qaeda we all know, has taken advantage of the situation. Them, along with other what are known as Islamist groups, have taken advantage of the situation and have essentially created a climate of insecurity in northern Mali.
So this would not have happened in Mali had it not been for the Arab uprisings?
You could say that the Arab uprisings have definitely been a catalyst for the Mali crisis.
In the Arab uprisings, what's the role that Hezbollah is playing? Is Hezbollah really just an extension of Iran?
Hezbollah, they are not essentially an extension of Iran, but they do operate in favor of Iranian interests a lot of the time. Iran supplies Hezbollah with money and weaponry and are one of the major contributors to Hezbollah. The Syrian regime is also a major contributor to Hezbollah. And essentially what Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah all have in common is they are all of the Shia Islam denomination. Now, like I said, while Hezbollah doesn't necessarily operate directly through Iran, I should restate that. They don't operate always for Iranian interests. They do operate together in some ways. Now, especially where Lebanon is concerned, Hezbollah has first of all, Lebanon is where Hezbollah is based, and Hezbollah has a significant hold on the internal politics of Lebanon. This is where a lot of their power comes from. Now, Iran has also been known to use Hezbollah operatives in the past, or has been suspected of using them, for a number of incidents involving, first of all, their shadow conflict, or what's known as their shadow conflict between Israel. And militants working for Hezbollah have been known to conduct operations around the world in favor of Iranian interests. And especially in places like Bahrain, for instance, would be a good example to use.
And Bahrain was one of the things I was going to ask about next. I'm seeing on Facebook a lot of pictures of violence in Bahrain, enough so that you've got to respect the people who are standing up to that violence and respect just how bad things must be for them to face that type of repression.
I can't imagine, honestly. Bahrain is a really interesting example, actually. Like many countries in the Middle East, Bahrain suffers from the Sunni-Shia divide. And what that essentially is that the people who control Bahrain are made up of Sunni Muslims, whereas the population, the majority of the population that lives in Bahrain, are Shia. And essentially the Sunnis retain their will over the Shia population in favor of Sunnis. So there is obviously a lot of Shia resistance within Bahrain, and kind of a natural tendency to want to resist this Sunni government who favors Sunni people.
Is this a reflection then of what we've been seeing in Iraq for the last decade?
Yeah, it's very similar in that way. Whereas you had Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni, ruling over a very divided country between Sunnis and Shias and Kurds and every other group.
I guess the last thing I want to talk about, this was the concept of America becoming unmoored from the United States. And especially since you're a Canadian, the hubris that we have as a nation calling ourselves Americans, when there's a whole swath of land that is considered America, and we're just a small part of it. But my feeling is that America itself has become more a set of principles and agreements that don't take into account the needs of the United States anymore. They take into account the needs of the corporations and the, empire. I think the growth of empire is also separate from the needs of the populace.
I always find it interesting looking at the discrepancies between how a government operates within its own territorial borders compared to how a government will operate in the international arena. And essentially the same rules do not apply. I mean, we can talk at length about why that is, but I think what's more interesting is how what the United States does in the international arena and how what it does at home is now becoming very divisive within your country. And especially as we are seeing, I mean, the creation of the Occupy movement and the creation of the Tea Party really shows the question of what is the United States and who are, speaking from an American perspective, let's say, who are we as Americans? What are we? And that really exemplifies the divisiveness in the country at the moment and really shows how divisive your politics are, essentially.
I find it striking to talk with you about how we are as Americans, because that indicates to me already that if there's a Canadian vision of how we are as Americans and a United States vision of how we are as Americans, then the concept of America has already transcended borders, national borders.
Oh, absolutely. It's hard to go anywhere in the world without having some kind of perspective of the United States. And the concept of America, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's exported all over the world. It would be very difficult for the United States to not be everywhere, especially being essentially the world's biggest economy and biggest military actor. There's just no way that its influence couldn't transcend borders like it does. And I think that's just the nature of the international system.
Yeah, I agree. And my thesis, though, I guess, is that it has become an international system, and it is no longer attached to any one location, any one geography. It's not attached to geography anymore. It's attached to philosophy and implementation.
I think that's really interesting. And I guess really the question would be is what is America then? Because, I mean, that becomes more of a subjective question. And at the same time, what image does America project to the rest of the world? And what does America want the image to be that they project to the rest of the world? I agree with you. I mean, if you're looking at it from that perspective, then it's hard to pinpoint exactly what America is and what the United States is and even where it is, like you say. I agree.
I wish I had started this particular part of the conversation sooner, but I'm going to have a tough time editing our conversation down into something that will fit into my show as it is. But this has been a great conversation and one that I've been looking forward to.
Oh, yeah, me too.
I definitely want to thank you for coming on to Occupy Radio and sharing your wisdom.
Sure thing. Okay, thanks very much, David. It's been a pleasure.
Craig Graham keeps you updated on where people are shooting at each other and why on globalconflictanalysis.com.